How's it going, everybody? Now today we've already looked at kind of the beginnings of the Cold War. So what I want to do today is I want to kind of go into different regions of the Cold War, since it really was a global conflict that had a lot of really important impacts across the world. So today we're going to focus on Latin America. Next week we'll focus on Asia, and then we'll kind of look at it from a more modern perspective by going back to Eastern Europe on our third week and kind of looking at the impact there. Now, it's important to note that the Cold War, like I said, isn't a typical war, right? It's more about kind of a covert, behind the scenes war in which various nations, primarily the US and the USSR, are really trying to one up each other and try to get the upper hand by getting more people on their side. So we'll kind of see how that spills over into Latin America today. Now, just as a quick reminder, here's some kind of Cold War strategies and ideas that we already talked about a little bit, but I'll just go into it again. So the Cold War lasts for about 45 years, from 46 to 91, okay? It's, like I said, not a traditional war. It's more about kind of gaining control around the world and influence around the world. It's primarily the US and the Soviet Union, and it's kind of fighting over the support of the various third world countries. Now, like I said, today, third world refers to poor countries, at least colloquially, but back then referred to countries that were not aligned with either side. They weren't either on the US's side or the Soviet Union side. Okay. The CIA and the KGB were very important figures in this war. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Soviet KGB, they were basically the ones doing this kind of covert fighting across the world, trying to either support certain people or overthrow other people or spy on each other, all these various things, right? And the typical strategies of the Cold War were, again, giving foreign aid, like the Marshall Plan, propaganda, espionage, spying on each other, brinksmanship, which means to kind of constantly or every once in a while bring us to the brink of real war and seeing who will blink first, kind of like a game of chicken, and then backing down. Surrogate wars, which is another term for proxy wars, basically supporting one side or the other, and then these major alliances like NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Okay. And there was a small group called the Third Force of Independent Nations who refused help from both the Soviets and the United States. And these were nations that wanted to kind of stay on their own. That was a smaller group, but there were certain nations who were kind of able to stay neutral in this huge global conflict. And as I said here earlier, these are some examples of the strategies: foreign aid, giving money to nations, Marshall Plan, espionage, the U-2 incident. That's very interesting. U-2 spy plane incident. You guys should definitely check that out. There's a really good book written about it by the pilot who was shot down and captured. There's also, obviously you can watch some videos on it. NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Propaganda, for example, Radio Free Europe was a radio station whose purpose it was to kind of spread, propaganda. Brinksmanship, same thing. Back down, but before you back down, you kind of bring us to the brink of war, major war. So, for example, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we'll talk about today, that's an example of brinksmanship. And then these surrogate wars. So, for example, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the war in Afghanistan. These are all examples of the U.S. supporting one side, the Soviets supporting the other. So, let's look at Latin America. We'll start off with Nicaragua. Now, in Nicaragua, we had a dictator, Somoza, who was supported by the U.S. Since 1933. Okay, the U.S. liked him. He kind of did what we asked him to do. He was good for American business. The U.S. had a lot of fruit companies, especially, and other business interests in the area. And so while he was a repressive dictator, he did support what we wanted. In the Cold War period, a new group emerged, which were the Sandinistas and Ortega, who were communists, and then the Contras, who were backed by the U.S. Okay, the Sandinistas eventually and Ortega eventually gained power, and so those who were exiled, the Contras, they were basically sent to to Honduras, and exiled there. And the U.S. then started to support these Contras by giving them weapons, giving them money. There was a huge scandal where the U.S. was actually selling weapons to Iran, and they weren't supposed to do that because at this point Iran was on essentially a blacklist because of their because of all the actions that were going on there and the kind of Islamic State that was being built there. And then they're using the money from those weapons to support the Contras, right? And this was super legal. Congress found out about it. This guy, Colonel Oliver North, destroyed documents and evidence to hide what happened. And this went all the way up to the president, right? Well, a civil war broke out between the Contras and the Sandinistas in Ortega. And then in 1984, essentially what the Sandinistas decided to do, the communists who were in power, they said, okay, you know what? Fine, we'll hold elections. We'll see who wins. They held elections, and they won. And the U.S. was quick to say, oh, this is just like a communist sham. It wasn't free elections, blah, blah, blah. But actually about 76, I believe, % of people in the country actually voted. And various other nations and organizations, churches and stuff like that, they all sent people to double check if the elections were actually free and fair. And most of them found, yeah, these were actually pretty fair elections. So it kind of showed that, even though the U.S. felt like it was helping the people against this dictatorship that they viewed as a communist dictatorship, sometimes the anti-American sentiment that came from our actions was stronger than the anti-communist sentiment or anti-dictatorial sentiment or whatever, right? So that's kind of always been the story of the U.S. and Latin America, is that we try to do too much, right? And then we end up turning people against us, right? Even if we think we're helping out the people, in many cases we're not. We're helping out companies that benefit the U.S. But even when we say we're helping out the people, oftentimes even the people might be benefited from that, right? I mean, life under communist regimes was never and has never really been that good for the vast majority of people. It led to a lot of anti-American sentiment. Okay, then we'll look at Guatemala and Chile. So these places are known as the banana republics because the U.S. had a lot of fruit companies, especially in Guatemala, that were U.S. owned and backed, and so they wanted the leaders of these countries to support basically the ideas that what they want, right? So in Guatemala, Jacobo Arbenz was a democratically elected leader, but he was kind of redistributing land, taking it away from the American companies, and giving it to the poor peasants of Guatemala, who for a long time had been kind of limited in their ability to buy land because of these fruit companies that were buying up all the land, forcing them to work on it for pennies on the dollar. All right, so the U.S., the CIA then basically overthrew Arbenz, and then there was a civil war in Guatemala that lasted 36 years. Huge instability, huge numbers of death, really, really horrible event. Arbenz was exiled. He went to a variety of different countries. He eventually kind of drank himself to death in Mexico in 1971. That was really kind of a sad end for everyone. Eventually, in like 2001 or something, the U.S. kind of apologized for it, sort of, but the damage was done. In Chile, we have Salvador Allende, who was a socialist leader of Chile, but again, he went against what the U.S. and the United Fruit Company wanted, and so he was overthrown, and the U.S. supported a guy named Augusto Pinochet, and essentially there was no more democracy, and Chile was then forced to live in a dictatorship in which many, many people were killed, people were silenced, right? There was no freedom of speech, no democracy, again, mostly for the support of an American fruit company, and this eventually became known as Chiquita. They had to rename themselves because they were kind of linked to these horrible events, and now they're still the same company. They're known as Chiquita, but their history is still the same. They're still the same company that did these things. And then we have Cuba. So in Cuba, we have, again, same thing, the U.S. supporting a dictator, Fulgencio Bautista. Fidel Castro emerges as a kind of force to oppose Batista and the dictatorship. He was a supporter of communism. He was a supporter of people like Che Guevara, seen here. And after the U.S. basically nationalized after Fidel Castro sought power, gained power, and nationalized all U.S.-owned sugar mills, which was the main kind of U.S. military interest on Cuba, the U.S. then put the embargo on Cuba. Castro then felt like he was cut off from the Western Hemisphere, so he turned to the Soviets, And then the U.S. at the same time started to train anti-Castro Cuban exiles, which would eventually lead to the Bay of Pigs invasion. So basically, the U.S., we trained all these people who were exiled from Cuba. They landed in the Bay of Pigs in April of '61, but it was a huge mistake. Okay, it was an embarrassing failure. They were barely able to do any damage at all. The U.S. didn't even provide air support, and then basically once they were captured, they basically said, "Oh yeah, the U.S. sent us," which led to a huge anti-American sentiment, especially in Cuba, but across Latin America, across the world. This event would then essentially directly lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Castro got very worried that the U.S. was going to launch another invasion of Cuba, and so he essentially turned to the Soviets. And the Soviets basically started shipping over nuclear weapons to Cuba so that they could be essentially shot at the U.S. very quickly and closely. They ended up setting up 42 missile sites across Cuba. The U.S. eventually got news of this or got wind of this when some spy plane photos revealed these launch sites being built, as you can see here. And then this led to a very tense 13-day period known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which both sides were on the brink of nuclear war. Both sides were ready to essentially hit the button and start World War III. And this would have been a much more costly world war because of the use of nuclear weapons on both sides. Eventually, the two sides backed down, right? Now, we found out much later, I believe in like 1991, that actually, while JFK and the U.S. thought that, yeah, they were building the launch sites, but they weren't ready to launch them yet, it turns out they were ready, and Castro was ready to use them, and he wanted to use them, essentially. So we were really that close to nuclear war on U.S. soil. It really would have been a massive event of the 20th century, but in the end, we were able to kind of cool off, and this is definitely kind of the climax of the Cold War, many would say. This, as well as the Vietnam War, which is going to kind of spark up soon. But these are kind of the major events of the Cold War, especially in Latin America. And you'll learn much more about this next year in U.S. history, so I am kind of glossing over it to a certain degree, but just so you have some background knowledge. Okay, and here we see, right, the range of the missiles on Cuba. They could have hit basically anywhere in the southeastern U.S., and then depending on what kind of missiles, right, if they had intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, they could have potentially reached all the way to the west coast of the U.S. as well. Okay. All right, so here is our summary activity for today. Here is a quote from the Truman Doctrine in which President Truman said, "I believe that it must be the policy of the U.S. to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. I believe that we must assist free people to work out their own destinies in their own way." So you're going to do two things on your Google Doc. Number one is rephrase what Truman said into more basic language, and then briefly explain what he is saying. And then in a few sentences, maybe a paragraph, to what extent do you agree with this sentiment? Should this apply to our modern world as well? So think about places like China nowadays, right? Under a communist totalitarian regime. Think about North Korea. Think about the various Islamic states that have emerged, right? Just think about those places, and is it our duty to help overthrow those totalitarian governments in place of more freely elected governments? Or should we not get involved in other people's business? Okay, so no right or wrong answer. I just want you guys to think about it. Use information from the lecture to answer your question. And that's it. All right, I will see you guys later.